Thank you, Tom. I'm now going to turn to public spending and think in particular about the Chancellor's statement yesterday that we can expect the era of austerity to be coming to an end. So what did we learn about public services spending at yesterday's budget? Back in March, in the spring statement, the Chancellor told us that he'd be setting a firm overall path for public spending for the years beyond 2020. The years up to 2020 were covered by the previous spending review. In the event, Mr. Hammond opted not to do so, so we were expecting him to set a firm overall spending amount and the next year divide it up between departments and set allocations. He instead set an indicative path for public spending for the 5 years up to 2023. 24. So that path is open to revision next year. So when the government comes at its spending review in 2019 to divide between departments, it might also choose to change the overall level of spending. And we still don't know which years will be covered. It didn't give us any insight there either. So it could be as few as 1 year, could be as many as 3 or 4. The other thing we learned yesterday, as Tom showed us, is that the Chancellor showed himself willing to spend his fiscal windfall rather than save it. And the fact that he spent it means that we've seen big changes in the path for day-to-day spending since the spring statement in March. We look here at the real level of day-to-day spending by departments on public services, or RDEL. You can think about that as the departments administering and delivering public services. That's fallen by about 8% since 2009-10. In March, the plans that the Chancellor set out implied that falling slightly over the next few years. But yesterday he announced a big spending increase, and now day-to-day spending by departments is set to grow steadily, heading back towards the level that we last experienced in 2009-10. That means that instead of a cut of almost 8 billion between 18-19 and 22-23, it's now set to increase by about 19 billion. That's a big change. As well as that change to the overall path for spending, the Chancellor made a few short-term spending announcements, using some of that windfall to increase spending in the near term. The Treasury costed that 11 billion of extra day-to-day spending in 2019-20 relative to what we'd expected back in March. A big chunk of that's for the NHS, about 7.5 billion. Of that 7.5 billion, about 5 billion is for frontline services in England, with the rest for higher employer pension contributions, which I'll come on to shortly, and some extra money for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as well. What this means is that overall spending outside of the NHS, defence and aid budgets, so outside of those protected areas, what I'm going to think about is those unprotected departments, on aggregate, overall spending on those areas won't fall next year. A few weeks ago, we thought it might be cut by around £4 billion. That's no longer the case. We might still see some individual departments fall slightly and some increase slightly, but overall, there's no longer a cut. Important to remember, however, that that comes on the back of cuts since 2010. So those unprotected areas outside of health are now about 19% lower than they were in 2010-11. So even if there's no further cuts to come next year, it's not as if they're reversing all the cuts they've experienced so far. Amongst those short-term measures that the Chancellor came with the budget include capital spending for the year in progress for 2018-19. That included about £500 million for roads and a similar amount for schools. Interestingly, the OBR assumed that around half of that won't get spent. We know that historically the government's proved that it struggles to spend capital spending, particularly if it's announced short-term and hasn't got time to plan. And so this assumption of an underspend from the OBR perhaps is understandable. Social care is set to get somewhere in the region of £1 billion this year and next year. It's interesting here that ring-fenced spending for social care, so spending that's earmarked particularly for social care, has been increasing quickly in the last few years. But it's difficult to actually enforce that that ring-fenced money does indeed go on social care. Local authorities are responsible for providing a number of services, and lots of them being cut back by more than social care have. So if you give them extra money, they might find a way to spend it on libraries or perhaps or planning services instead. So we don't actually know that all of that will end up going on social care. The defence budget got an extra £1 billion over this year and next for a number of reasons, but in part because of a black hole that opened up in the procurement budget following the depreciation of sterling, given that the defence budget involves buying a lot of equipment in dollars. Another change that's quite technical but very important that happened at the budget yesterday is that the government decided to lower the discount rate for calculating employer pension contributions. And what a lower discount rate means is higher costs for public sector employers in terms of the accrual of their employees' public service pensions. The government allocated almost £5 billion next year to the reserve to cover those costs, and that cost is set to rise to about £6.3 billion by 2023. And that's important because the government has decided to allocate that extra money towards those departments. It doesn't matter in terms of the overall level of public spending, because this money gets sent from the Treasury to departments, and departments send it back to the Treasury. But it does matter for what those departments have to do with the rest of their budget. So had the government not provided any extra compensation, departments would have had to find those savings elsewhere. This time, it looks like they won't have to, at least for the most part. This is in stark contrast to what happened last time the discount rate was lowered in March 2016, when the previous Chancellor opted not to compensate departments, and they were left to find about £2 billion of cuts from other parts of their budget. The NHS was subsequently compensated for that, perhaps suggesting its special status is nothing new, but other departments were not. Moving away from the immediate short-term gains, the one-off bonuses that the Chancellor announced yesterday, the medium-term giveaways are even bigger. So we're looking here at the changes in day-to-day spending, in nominal terms, in cash terms, relative to what we'd expected in March. So we had 11 billion extra for next year, rising to closer to 20 billion the year after, and more like 30 billion in 22-23. And the lion's share of that is accounted for by the NHS funding settlement, announced in June and then confirmed yesterday by the Chancellor. Under that settlement, frontline services for the NHS in England are set to receive about 20.5 billion extra in real terms in 2023-24 relative to 18-19. That doesn't cover non-NHS health budgets. So other parts of the Department of Health budget that include things like public health, medical research, training for medical staff, those areas are actually looking at going to be cut in the next year and the year after. We don't know what's going to happen after that. That will be determined at next year's spending review. But this settlement only covers one part of health spending. It does mean that health is set to account for an ever-growing share of total departmental spending. So as Paul said, health just grows and grows in terms of a share of what government does, from around 23% in 2000 to close to 40% we project at the end of this forecast period. And that really is a big change. It's true that in cash terms, this is a historically large increase in spending on health in the NHS. But that's true in part because we just spend a lot more now than we used to. So a given percentage increase means a bigger cash bonus. But it's not historically remarkable in terms of real growth. So to put it in historical context, we can think about growth in total spending on health in the UK. And since the NHS's conception, that's grown at about 3.7% a year, right through to last year. But within that, there's been periods of faster and slower growth. So during the last Labour government, spending on health in the UK increased about 6% a year on average, in contrast to 1.1% under the coalition and 1.2% under the Conservative government since 2015 up to last year. Now, we don't know exactly what's going to happen to UK health spending going forward. The government's announced a pot of money for frontline services in England. That doesn't even cover all health spending in England, never mind what happens in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. But if we assume that the government chooses to freeze non-NHS parts of the health budget, and let's say that Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland choose to pump this extra money that will be allocated into frontline services as well, we think it looks like overall health spending will go up something like 2.6% a year over the years of 23-24, slightly higher if you start from 18-19. That compares to 3.4% real growth on average in frontline services for the NHS, and what this looks like eventually will very much depend on what the government decides at the spending review next year. It does mean that funding for health is going to follow a very different path over the next few years than it has since 2010. So total spending by the Department of Health and Social Care since 2010 has been growing steadily. It's increased by something like 12–13%. The new funding announcement means it's set to grow even faster. Over the last 8 years, per capita spending, as the population has grown, has only increased by about 5%. But that's now set to grow faster as well and grow significantly in the next 5 years. When we take into account the fact that the population has aged and older people tend to make greater use of NHS services and they tend to be more expensive to treat, all we've had over the last 8 years has just been enough to keep track and keep pace with those changing demands from the elderly population. Hasn't been anything left to do anything more. That's going to change, and now this funding settlement means that we're going to do more than keep pace with the growing demands of the elderly population, and there'll be more money to pump into other parts of the health system. So as well as those day-to-day spending changes that I showed you earlier, the Chancellor also announced some cuts to departments' capital budgets, so the money that departments spend on investment projects and capital investment. And they're not as large as the increases in resource spending, but they do offset some of that overall giveaway. There is a takeaway in there as well. So we look at the overall limits that the Chancellor set out in March for departmental capital spending, and we compare them to what was announced yesterday. We can see that it's still set to increase, but there's less of a spike in 2020-21, and it's set to follow kind of a smoother increase. There's a sizable cut to that 2021 capital budget, but a large portion of that hadn't been allocated yet. We didn't know where it was going to go, who was going to be spending it. And the OBR assumed that, as a result, around $3 billion of it wouldn't have been spent at all. Perhaps in reflecting the fact that historically that's been the case. Governments have historically struggled to meet the level of investment that they plan to reach. So in the end, the forecast for actual spending was revised down only by $5.4 billion, reflecting a quirk of the existing system with the Treasury and the OBR. But that increase in capital spending is set to mean that public sector net investment is maintained at a relatively high level by historical standards, similar to the level that the Labour government reached just prior to the financial crisis, just above 2% of national income. That's set to be sustained for the next few years, reflecting this Chancellor, his repeated focus on capital spending at numerous budgets. But if we want to know, given the Chancellor's statements yesterday, what Theresa May said in the conference speech, have we reached the end of austerity? The answer, as is often the case when it comes to economics, is it depends. It really does matter a lot how we choose to define the end of austerity. There is no one single universally accepted definition. We need to think about what particular measure of spending we're focused on. We're going to think about a few. So if we look at overall spending on day-to-day public services, which I'm going to define here as total resource del, that's one way of thinking about it. But we also know that the government is protecting certain parts of its budget more than others. So the NHS is the obvious example, but the government's also committed to spend 2% of national income on defence, 0.7% of national income on aid. So we might want to look at unprotected departments outside of those areas to think about what prospects do they face in the next few years. Are they going to be facing further cuts? And finally, as Tom just talked about, we're still facing some cuts to social security. Still around $4 billion of cuts still in the pipeline that haven't worked their way through the system yet. And so how you think about austerity will depend on each of these things. So first of all, thinking about overall RDEL, so overall day-to-day spending on public services. This is similar to the line I showed you earlier. After falling gradually since 2010, it's now set to pick up and grow over the next few years. That's true in per capita terms, although it's not set to reach anywhere near the level that we had in 2009-10, still set to be up 10% lower in 23-24. And as a share of national income, it's set to essentially stay flat over the next 5 years. So when you look at this overall level of day-to-day spending, it looks like, at least on a fairly minimal definition, austerity is over. But of course, we know that different parts of the budget are following different paths. So again, looking at just total RDEL, but you know that protected areas are growing by more. So health, for example, is growing by far more. And that means that everything else, those unprotected areas, grow by less. So what this shows is that over the next 5 years, those unprotected areas essentially will be flat. That involves an increase next year in real terms, but then slowly falling after 1920, ending at the end of the forecast period essentially where we started. So if you think that an end to austerity means no more further real cuts to unprotected departments, that looks like it's been achieved. But of course, that ignores the fact that not only is the population growing, the economy is growing, demands on these services might be growing as well. If you want to maintain the level of spending that was set to have in 2019, the Chancellor would have to find about $3.5 billion in today's prices by the end of the forecast period. If we express the path for overall public service spending in per capita terms, it's set to grow by about 5% over the next 5 years. Again, protected departments set to grow by more, and unprotected departments are actually set to be cut. They're set to grow next year and then fall to be a few percent lower in 23-24. If the Chancellor wanted to maintain our current level of per capita day-to-day public service spending, you have to find about $4 billion or $6.5 billion to maintain the higher level we're set to have next year. So that means once we take account of the growth in the population, these unprotected services are still going to be facing cuts. And that doesn't sound too much like an end to austerity. So a lot here, and I mean a lot, depends on our definition, and there's no one perfect way to define it. If we look at overall spending on day-to-day services, it's set to increase in real terms and per capita terms and not fall any further as a share of national income. So in that definition, austerity for public services at least looks like it's over. But if we turn our eye instead to unprotected departments outside of the NHS, defence and aid, there's no further cuts on the whole up to 23-24. You can interpret that as the end of austerity. But we're set to see an increase next year, then cuts after 1920. So over the next spending review period, it might feel like austerity is continuing for those departments. And it is still set to fall in per capita terms and as a share of national income. So depending on how you want to think about it, the conclusion you draw isn't perfectly clear. What is clear is that we're not at the end of austerity for social security. There are still planned cuts to working age benefits, and the end of austerity does not appear in sight for that area. Thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Paul.